Hi, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. Today we'll be tackling in a fairly head-on way this universal mystery of the ultimate object of human desire. Have you ever wondered what it is we humans ultimately want out of life? Whether there's something that motivates us beyond this seemingly endless multiplicity of objects and objectives that occupies us in our daily lives. Have you experienced moments in your life when you felt close, perhaps, to being able to say what that is, but have been unable to actually put it into words, maybe, and wondered even if this secret of human happiness, or if you like, this essence of life, is even something that's capable of being expressed? Today I'll be bringing Plotinus on board to shed, I think, some valuable light on questions like these. We've been brought to this point in the series by trying to figure out a way out of what had seemed a dead end. You might remember that last time I talked about this dilemma that, in my view, philosophy seems to find itself in our time. On the one hand, being intensely distrustful of any kind of philosophical system, and therefore not having much to offer in the way of existential hope. And on the other hand, shaping itself into systems that are closed in the sense that they require our commitment to definite ways of understanding the world, to abstract principles that perhaps will never be able to fully account for the world or human desire in its seemingly infinite complexity. One thing I also mentioned a couple of episodes ago is that dilemmas tend to have a false assumption underlying them. You find your way out of them by finding out what this false assumption is. And Platonism shows us, I think, the false assumption here. The false assumption that had gotten us backed into a corner is that a philosophical system need be closed-ended. Probably the most wondrous thing about Platonism and Platonic teaching on desire in particular is that it forms a system, but an open-ended one, because the principle that it's based on, as strange as this might seem, is not an abstraction. It's not a mere concept, not a mere object of thought, not something that you can even really think about. We've actually touched on this before. You might remember, for example, how Plato talked in his Republic about the principle of everything being the good, and of how none of us has an adequate knowledge of the good. There's something about the good for Plato that is unlike any other idea. There's something in its nature that humans can never fully grasp. And then a little bit later in the Republic, he says something else that we haven't talked about yet in this series. He talks about how every branch of knowledge is based on what he calls a hypothesis, which in Greek has this sense of something being placed under something else. A concept that the mind can put some weight on, can lean on. A clear and distinct idea, if you will, that it can base its reasoning on. Something firm and solid that it can put its weight on like a mental stepping stone. But the first principle of everything, Plato says, is not like this. It is anoupathetos. It's something the mind can come to but doesn't lean on in the same simple way that it leans on ordinary concepts. So what on earth could Plato mean by this? It's clear in the Republic that Glaucon, one of Socrates' companions in this discussion, has difficulty with this idea, and it's also not been easy for modern day interpreters to come to a clear consensus about either. But here again, I think, Plotinus, writing more than 600 years after Plato, opens Plato up for us. The good for Plotinus is the same as the one, that is, being in its absolute unity. And the one is, in a way, beyond human conception. The reason for this is that human thought involves combination and division in the form of an attribute of some kind being combined with a subject. So, for example, in the statement, "This hat is red," we have a combination of two things, a hat and its redness. In a way, the hat and the redness are combined as one, but the mind still holds them apart as two things, a subject and its attribute. But the absolute unity of being, to be truly one, can't consist of two things like this, subject and attribute. It must transcend the division of them. It must transcend the division of subject and attribute. In fact, writes Plotinus, there's something paradoxical about any kind of talk about the one, because even the word one is not really appropriate to it. But we use the word one out of a need to point to it somehow. He writes, quote, "Indeed, in truth, no name suits it. But if indeed one has to name it, it is fitting to call it one, as is usually done, but not so that it is something else and then one." So not a somehow it must be grasped in its absolute unity. For this reason, Plotinus writes, the one, the principle of reality, which is also, let's not forget, the good, the ultimate object of human desire, is actually not an object, not even an object of thought. It's not a mental object that exists separately from the I, the thinking subject. And so it will necessarily elude any kind of discourse, any kind of discursive reasoning, including science. There's a sense in which we can talk about it. In fact, we do need to be able to point to it in some way, to have some sort of cognition of it in order to understand reality and our own desire, so that we can hope for meaningful, intentional lives. But our speech about it will always be imperfect, and our cognition of it will not be by means of abstraction. In fact, our cognition of the one is about as hard to talk about as the one itself. It is unitive in some way. It involves a unity of subject and object that is comparable in some ways to immediate forms of perception, like seeing and feeling, where you don't really feel, there's an immediacy in the way when you glimpse something, you don't feel, you aren't aware in a way of your difference from what you're seeing as a subject of perception. So it's comparable in some ways to immediate forms of perception, like seeing and feeling, or of various kinds of unity, immediacy that humans experience, like sexual and other kinds of intimacy. And Plotinus, like Plato does with the good, likes to use these metaphors in writing about our cognition of the one, and also of being with it, or being present to it. He doesn't write about thinking about it. He writes, "The biggest puzzle arising is that comprehension of the one is neither by scientific understanding," that's a translation of the Greek word episteme, "nor by intellection, as it is in the case of other intelligibles. It corresponds rather to a presence, which is better than scientific understanding. But the soul undergoes a departure from its unity whenever it attains scientific understanding. For scientific understanding involves an account, and an account is multiple, subject and attribute. The soul then passes by the one when it falls into number and multiplicity, so this duality of subject and object. So it should run above scientific understanding and in no way exit from its unity, and should depart from scientific understanding and the objects of scientific understanding. And a little later he says, for this reason, Plato says that it is neither to be, and he means the one, of course, the one is neither to be spoken nor written of. And so Plotinus seems to be alluding to the seventh letter here. You might remember we spoke about that a few episodes ago. Unlike some scholars today, he seems not to question the genuineness of the seventh letter, and he also doesn't seem to question that Plato saw any difference between the good, the principle as he understood it, and the one either. So for this reason, Plato says that it is neither to be spoken nor written of. We do speak and write of it by way of directing others toward it, waking them up from discursive accounts to actual looking, as though we were showing the way to those wanting to see something. And a little later he says, the one is certainly absent from nothing and from everything. It is present without being present, except to those who are able to receive it and who are prepared for it, so as to be harmonious with it and, in a way, grasp it and touch it. So it's clear that for Plotinus, as we saw a few episodes ago, cognition of the one is an ecstatic experience, and he really strains the capacity of language, not to mention lapsing into past tense, to describe what we might call this supra-rational cognition. He writes, they were not two, but the seer was one with what was seen. And a little later, he was a one, containing no difference relative to himself, nor in any other respect. For nothing moved in him, neither spiritedness nor appetite for anything else was present in him when he reverted to the one. But also not reason nor intellection, nor he himself, if one should say that. He was instead ravished. The Greek word means snatched away or carried off, or ecstatic. And this is a translation of the Greek word enthusiastos, in solitary quiet. He was instead ravished or ecstatic in solitary quiet, in an unwobbling fixedness, unwavering from his own substantiality in any way, not rotating about himself. And that might sound a bit silly, but I think he's talking about the way in thinking we rotate, we turn things over in our minds. Entirely stable, as if he were the stability itself. I'm using, by the way, the 2018 translation of Plotinus's Enneads, which was done by a team of scholars led by the University of Toronto's Lloyd Gerson, and which seems to have quickly established itself as the standard translation. Plotinus also uses this metaphor of moving through the outer parts of a Greek temple to the inner sanctum, the aduton, the part of the temple which means literally not to be entered, as it was a holy place in which only the priests were allowed. So not ordinary thoughts can penetrate in here. And he writes, it is like someone who enters the inner sanctum and leaves behind the statues of the gods in the temple. And these are the first things one sees on leaving the inner sanctum after the vision within. The intimate contact within is not with a statue or an image, but with the one itself. The statue and the image are actually secondary visions. And I don't know if he's talking maybe about mental concepts here. They're actually secondary visions. Whereas the one itself is indeed not a vision, but another manner of seeing. And that's what I had in mind, this idea that I would write a book. This video series is based on research and notes that I did when I was preparing a book, and I was going to call it Another Kind of Seeing, Why the World Needs Platonic Love, because I was quite taken with that phrase. The one itself is indeed not a vision, but another manner of seeing. It is self-transcendence, which is interestingly how Gerson and his team render this Greek word ecstasis. They render this other word enthusiasas as ecstatic, but then when they encounter ecstatic, they render it as self-transcendence. It is self-transcendence, ecstasis, simplification, and surrender, an urging towards touch, a resting, concentration on alignment. So this, I think, is one way that Platonic teaching on love saves us from our modern predicament. Clearly, on the one hand, there must be a principle to any philosophy because the mind craves answers and won't be satisfied without them. And the same goes for the ultimate object of our desire, I think. It's something we instinctively seek to formulate. In both cases, we need to be able to point to something, to set our hand, or in the case of desire, to set our sights on something. And yet at the same time, we sense, I think, that this something, this stuff of life, this ultimate object of our desire, seems impossible to really formulate. We feel a reluctance to foist abstractions onto reality and onto our own desire. And so in Plato, we seem to be able to miraculously have it both ways, a structure of hope, but also the potential for a radical openness to reality, an allowing of reality to simply be what it is, in a way unspeakable. And since for Plato the ultimate object of desire is the same as the principle of reality, the same goes for the mystery of human desire. Platonism found this way to at once point to the ultimate object of our desire without making it dogmatically conform to anything, without painting it into a philosophical corner. So the obvious question we now run into, of course, is how does one action this ecstasy? How does one come to unity? How does one attain it if it's not an object or even an objective, really? And I would like to move on to seeing how the tradition of Platonic love answers this question for us. But actually, first, I'm all too aware that I've been neglecting another question that I said I'd answer several episodes ago, one that I think we kind of need to get to first. The obvious objection to all this is that we do not see in any obvious way human beings seeking the good and or the one. I mean, do you think we do? In fact, it can seem quite the opposite. The writer William Golding once said that he had written his book Lord of the Flies to demonstrate this idea that humans are in fact naturally evil. In an essay looking back on that book, which came out in 1954, Lord of the Flies came out in 1954, and this is from a book of essays that was published in the late 60s. He wrote, "Before the Second World War, I believed in the perfectibility of social man, that a correct structure of society would produce goodwill, and that therefore you could remove all social ills by a reorganization of society. It is possible that today I believe something of the same again, but after the war I did not, because I was unable to. I discovered what one man could do to another. I am not talking of one man killing another with a gun, or dropping a bomb on him, or blowing him up, or torpedoing him. I am thinking of the vileness beyond all words that went on year after year in the totalitarian states. It is bad enough to say that so many Jews were exterminated in this way, and that so many people liquidated. Lovely, elegant word. But there were things done during that period from which I still have to avert my mind, lest I should be physically sick. They were done skillfully, coldly, by educated men, doctors, lawyers, by men with a tradition of civilization behind them, to beings of their own kind. I do not want to elaborate this. I would like to pass on, but I must say that anyone who moved through those years without understanding that man produces evil as a bee produces honey must have been blind or wrong in the head. So, though we might not share Golding's rather bleak view of human nature, I think the idea that humans are ultimately motivated by nothing other than the good might still seem kind of implausible to us, or impossibly naive, perhaps. It's not hard to find examples of vice in our own behavior or of those around us. And the principle of life, as modern science conceives it, is selfishness, the tendency basically for genes to replicate themselves. So why would Plato put forth an idea that seems to fly in the face of both everyday experience and science? How can it possibly make sense to think of human beings as ultimately desiring nothing but the good? That's what I'll be starting to talk about next time. Anyway, hope to see you then, and again, thanks for watching.